The moment Angela Rayner looked directly at Boris Johnson and said, "Your lies have cost lives, and everyone in this chamber knows it," the entire House of Commons fell into stunned silence. What happened in the next 30 seconds would not only destroy Johnson's carefully crafted comeback narrative, but expose him so thoroughly that even his own conservative colleagues couldn't defend him. This wasn't just another parliamentary exchange. This was the moment Labour's deputy leader systematically dismantled the former Prime Minister's reputation with facts, fury, and a precision that left him speechless for the first time in his political career. Before we dive into this incredible political destruction, make sure to hit that like button if you want to see more stories about politicians getting the accountability they deserve, and don't forget to subscribe with notifications on so you never miss the latest political drama. Trust me, what Angela Rayner did to Boris Johnson is something that will be talked about for decades. It all started during what should have been a routine debate about the government's housing policy in the House of Commons. Johnson, who had been working to rebuild his political reputation after his disgraceful resignation as Prime Minister, thought he could score easy points by attacking Labour's housing proposals. The former PM had been making a political comeback of sorts, appearing regularly in Parliament and on television, trying to position himself as an elder statesman who could offer wisdom on the issues facing Britain. His allies had been promoting him as someone who could provide experienced leadership in challenging times. But Johnson made a fatal mistake. During his speech criticising Labour's housing policy, he decided to make a personal attack on Angela Rayner, questioning her qualifications to speak on housing issues and suggesting that someone from her background couldn't possibly understand the complexities of housing policy. The comment was loaded with class-based condescension and barely disguised misogyny. Johnson was essentially saying that Rayner, who had grown up in social housing and worked her way up from teenage mother to deputy leader of the Labour Party, wasn't qualified to discuss housing because of her working-class background. The chamber erupted with angry shouts from Labour MPs, but Rayner herself sat quietly, taking notes, her expression calm but focused. She had been waiting for this moment, a chance to confront Johnson directly about his record, his lies, and his legacy of failure. When the Speaker called for order and gave Rayner the floor to respond, she stood up slowly, looked directly at Johnson, and delivered the line that would end his political rehabilitation. "Your lies have cost lives, and everyone in this chamber knows it." The silence that followed was deafening. Johnson's face went pale. Conservative MPs shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the political annihilation that followed would remind everyone exactly why Boris Johnson had been forced from office in disgrace. To understand why this confrontation was so devastating for Boris Johnson, you need to know exactly who these two people are and why Rayner was uniquely positioned to destroy him. Angela Rayner represents everything that Johnson has always looked down upon: working-class authenticity, genuine struggle, and real achievement earned through hard work rather than privilege. At 44, Rayner had one of the most inspiring personal stories in British politics. She left school at 16 with no qualifications, pregnant and living in a council flat. She worked as a care worker while studying for her GCSEs and A-levels, then became a trade union representative fighting for workers' rights. Her rise through the Labour Party was based on substance, not style, fighting for ordinary people, understanding their struggles because she had lived them herself. As deputy leader of the Labour Party, Rayner had built a reputation as one of the most effective parliamentary performers of her generation. She combined passionate advocacy for working people with sharp intelligence and an ability to cut through political spin with devastating directness. But what made Rayner particularly dangerous to someone like Johnson was her authenticity. While Johnson had spent his career crafting personas and telling people what they wanted to hear, Rayner had built her reputation on telling uncomfortable truths and fighting for people who didn't have a voice. On housing specifically, Rayner had lived experience that Johnson could never match. She had grown up in social housing, understood the challenges facing working families, and had spent years as an MP fighting for better housing policies. When she spoke about housing, she wasn't reading from briefing notes. She was speaking from personal experience. Boris Johnson, meanwhile, represented everything that was wrong with British politics: privilege, entitlement, and a complete disconnect from the struggles of ordinary people. Born into wealth, educated at Eton and Oxford, Johnson had never faced real hardship or uncertainty in his life. Johnson's political career had been built on a foundation of lies, scandals, and failures. As a journalist, he had been fired for making up quotes. As a politician, he had been caught lying repeatedly about everything from Brexit to personal scandals. As Prime Minister, his dishonesty had finally caught up with him when his own MPs forced him to resign in disgrace. The lies that had defined Johnson's career weren't just political theater. They had real consequences for real people. His lies about Brexit had misled voters about the economic consequences of leaving the EU. His lies about COVID policies had confused public health messaging during a pandemic. His lies about personal conduct had undermined trust in government at a time when people needed clear, honest leadership. But perhaps most damaging were Johnson's lies about his own government's policies. He had repeatedly claimed success on housing, claiming his government was building more homes and helping more families onto the housing ladder. The reality was very different. Housing became less affordable under his leadership, homelessness increased, and the housing crisis deepened. The stakes for this confrontation couldn't have been higher. Johnson was trying to rehabilitate his image and position himself for a potential political comeback. He needed to convince people that his previous failures were in the past and that he could still offer valuable leadership. For Rayner, this was an opportunity to remind the country exactly why Johnson had been unfit for office and why his attempt at rehabilitation should be rejected. She had the facts, the moral authority, and the personal experience to expose Johnson's record in a way that no one else could. The housing debate was the perfect battleground for this confrontation. Johnson's record on housing was particularly weak. Despite years of promises, his government had failed to build enough homes, failed to make housing more affordable, and failed to address the housing crisis that was affecting millions of families. Rayner, meanwhile, had been one of the most effective critics of the government's housing failures. She had the statistics, the case studies, and the personal credibility to make a devastating case against Johnson's record. The personal dimension of the confrontation made it even more significant. Johnson's condescending comment about Rayner's background wasn't just politically tone-deaf, it was morally offensive. Here was a man born into privilege suggesting that someone who had actually lived the housing crisis couldn't understand housing policy. The comment revealed everything that was wrong with Johnson's worldview. He believed that background and class mattered more than competence and experience. He thought that his Eton education made him more qualified to discuss housing than someone who had actually lived in social housing. For Rayner, Johnson's comment was personal in a way that went beyond politics. It was an attack on her legitimacy, her intelligence, and her right to speak for the people she represented. It was exactly the kind of class-based snobbery that she had been fighting against her entire political career. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be about more than just housing policy. It would be about privilege versus experience, honesty versus dishonesty, and authenticity versus performance. Johnson thought he could intimidate Rayner with his reputation and his rhetoric. He was about to learn that attacking someone who had fought for everything she had achieved was the biggest mistake of his political comeback attempt. The housing debate had been proceeding along predictable lines for the first hour. Conservative MPs praised the government's record while Labour MPs criticized it. The exchange was routine parliamentary business until Boris Johnson rose to speak. Johnson had been sitting quietly during most of the debate, occasionally chatting with Conservative colleagues and checking his phone. As a former Prime Minister, he didn't often participate in policy debates anymore, preferring to save his interventions for major occasions when they would get maximum media attention. but something about the housing debate seemed to irritate him. Perhaps it was the criticism of policies he had implemented as PM. Perhaps it was the way Labour MPs were highlighting the housing crisis that had worsened under his leadership. Or perhaps he simply saw an opportunity to attack Angela Rayner, who had been one of his most effective critics during his time in office. When Johnson stood to speak, the chamber fell quiet. Despite his disgraceful departure from office, he still commanded attention as a former Prime Minister. MPs from both sides settled in to hear what he had to say. Johnson began with his typical rhetorical flourishes, defending his government's housing record and attacking Labour's proposals. His speech was vintage Johnson, lots of bluster, classical references, and carefully crafted sound bites designed for the evening news. "Mr. Speaker," Johnson began, "we've heard a lot of criticism today from the opposition benches, but where are their solutions? Where are their plans? Where is their understanding of the complex challenges facing housing policy in modern Britain?" It was standard political rhetoric, but Johnson was building towards something more personal. His voice began to take on the condescending tone that had made him so many enemies during his time as PM. "The honourable member for Ashton-under-Lyne speaks with great passion about housing," Johnson continued, referring to Rayner without naming her directly. "But passion without understanding, emotion without expertise, simply isn't enough when we're dealing with issues this complex." Labour MPs began shouting objections, but Johnson pressed on, his voice getting louder and more combative. "Housing policy requires experience in government, understanding of economic principles, and knowledge of how these complex systems actually work," he said, looking directly at Rayner. Someone from her background couldn't possibly understand the complexities of housing policy or the difficult decisions that need to be made. The chamber erupted. Labour MPs were on their feet shouting, "Shame!" and "Withdraw." Conservative MPs looked uncomfortable, many of them avoiding eye contact with their colleagues across the aisle. Even some Tory MPs seemed shocked by the blatant, class-based attack. But Johnson wasn't finished. Emboldened by the reaction he was getting, he decided to double down on his attack. "We need housing policies based on evidence and expertise, not emotional appeals from people who think their personal experiences qualify them to understand complex economic policies," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The Speaker called for order, but the damage was done. Johnson had essentially argued that Rayner's working-class background and personal experience with housing issues made her less qualified to discuss housing policy than him. It was exactly the kind of elitist, tone-deaf comment that had contributed to Johnson's downfall as Prime Minister. But this time, he had made the mistake of directing it at someone who was uniquely positioned to destroy him. Angela Rayner had been sitting quietly during Johnson's speech, taking notes and occasionally shaking her head. Unlike many of her Labour colleagues, she hadn't shouted objections or jumped to her feet. She had been waiting for him to finish so she could respond properly. As the Speaker called for order and the shouting died down, Rayner stood to respond. The chamber fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Her opening line, "Your lies have cost lives, and everyone in this chamber knows it," hit like a thunderbolt. The directness, the moral authority, the sheer audacity of calling a former Prime Minister a liar to his face left the entire chamber stunned. Johnson's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected such a direct personal attack. His usual confident demeanor cracked, and for the first time in the exchange, he looked genuinely rattled. But Rayner was just getting started. She had been preparing for this moment, and she was going to make the most of it. "The right honourable gentleman wants to talk about qualifications and background," Rayner continued, her voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "Let me tell him about my qualifications." She paused, looking directly at Johnson, letting the tension build. "I grew up in social housing. I know what it's like to live in a damp flat with no heating because the landlord won't fix it. I know what it's like to worry about whether your family will have a roof over their heads next month." The personal testimony was devastating because it was authentic. While Johnson had been attacking her background, Rayner was turning it into her greatest strength. I know what it's like to work multiple jobs just to pay the rent. I know what it's like to be a young mother trying to find decent housing for your children. I know what these policies mean for real families because I've lived it. Conservative MPs were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Johnson's attack on Rayner's background was backfiring spectacularly, and they knew it. But Rayner wasn't done with her personal story. She was building towards something bigger. And then I became a care worker, looking after elderly people who were being failed by housing policies that didn't understand their needs. I became a trade union representative, fighting for working families who were being priced out of their communities by housing policies that favored developers over residents. Each sentence was building momentum, showing how Rayner's background hadn't disqualified her from understanding housing policy. It had given her insights that no amount of elite education could provide. So yes, Rayner said, her voice getting stronger. I do understand housing policy. I understand it in a way that someone who was born into privilege and has never worried about paying rent could never understand. The attack on Johnson's privileged background was devastating because it was true. While Rayner had lived the housing crisis, Johnson had inherited wealth and had never faced housing insecurity in his life. But then Rayner shifted from defense to offense, and the real destruction began. But let's talk about the right honorable gentleman's record on housing, she said, pulling out a folder thick with documents. Let's talk about what his expertise actually delivered for the British people. The sight of Rayner's prepared materials sent a chill through the Conservative benches. They knew she had done her homework, and they knew Johnson's record was indefensible. During his time as Prime Minister, housing became less affordable, not more affordable. Rayner began reading. From her notes, home ownership fell to its lowest level in decades. Homelessness increased. The housing waiting list grew longer. Each statistic was delivered with devastating precision. Johnson tried to interrupt, but Rayner ignored him and continued. His government promised 300,000 new homes per year. They delivered fewer than 200,000. They promised to make housing more affordable. Average house prices increased by 15% during his tenure. The numbers were damning because they were true. Johnson's housing record was one of failure after failure, despite his grand promises. But Rayner was building toward something even more devastating. She was about to remind everyone why Johnson had really been forced from office. What happened next was like watching a masterclass in political destruction. Angela Rayner didn't just respond to Boris Johnson's attack. She systematically demolished his credibility, exposed his failures, and reminded the entire country why he had been forced from office in disgrace. Having established her credentials and destroyed Johnson's housing record with statistics, Rayner was ready to deliver the knockout blow. She closed her folder of housing statistics and looked directly at Johnson. But housing failures are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes. To this man's record, she said, her voice filled with moral authority. Because the truth is, every policy failure, every broken promise, every crisis that he mishandled can be traced back to the same fundamental problem. The chamber was dead silent. Everyone knew something significant was coming. This is a man who has lied consistently, repeatedly, and shamelessly throughout his entire political career, Rayner continued, her voice getting stronger. And those lies have had real consequences for real people. Johnson tried to stand and object, but the speaker waved him down, recognizing that Rayner was making a substantial point about his record. Let me remind this chamber of just some of the lies that the right honorable gentleman has told, Rayner said, pulling out another folder. Because when we're talking about qualifications for office, honesty should be the most basic requirement. What followed was a methodical destruction of Johnson's credibility that was devastating in its comprehensiveness and accuracy. He lied about Brexit, claiming it would save $350 million per week for the NHS. That was false, and he knew it was false when he said it, Rayner began, her voice clear and precise. He lied about the Northern Ireland Protocol, claiming it would protect the Good Friday Agreement while actually threatening it. He lied about COVID restrictions, telling the public to follow rules that he himself was breaking in Downing Street. Each lie was documented, proven, and had real consequences for British people. Johnson sat in his seat, his face getting redder with each accusation. He lied about Chris Pincher, claiming he didn't know about allegations of sexual misconduct when appointing him to a senior position. That lie finally brought down his government when his own MPs couldn't defend it anymore. The reminder of the Pincher affair was particularly damaging because it was the scandal that had finally ended Johnson's career as Prime Minister. Even Conservative MPs had admitted they couldn't defend Johnson's dishonesty about that appointment. But Rayner wasn't finished. She was about to connect Johnson's pattern of lies to the housing crisis that had brought them to this debate. And he lied repeatedly about housing policy, she continued. He promised affordable homes for young families, while his policies made housing less affordable. He promised to solve the housing crisis while homelessness increased under his watch. She pulled out a specific document. This is from 2019, when he promised that his government would deliver the most ambitious housing program in a generation. 4 years later, we have fewer social homes, higher rents, and more families in temporary accommodation. The contrast between Johnson's promises and his delivery was stark and undeniable. But then Rayner did something that elevated her attack from political point scoring to moral reckoning. She connected Johnson's lies to real human costs. These aren't just political failures, she said, her voice filled with passion. These are real families who can't afford homes because of his policies. These are young people who can't buy their first home because of his failures. These are elderly people dying in cold, damp housing because of his neglect. The human dimension of Johnson's failures was devastating because it made his lies personal rather than political. When I said his lies have cost lives, I meant it literally, Rayner continued. During the COVID pandemic, his mixed messages and dishonesty about restrictions cost lives. People died because they couldn't trust what the government was telling them. She paused, letting that sink in, then delivered the line that would be remembered forever. How many excess deaths during COVID can be traced to the government's contradictory messaging? How many families lost loved ones because they couldn't trust a prime minister who was breaking his own rules? The chamber was completely silent. Even Conservative MPs couldn't defend Johnson's COVID record, which had been widely criticized for its inconsistency and dishonesty. But Rayner still had one more devastating point to make. She was about to remind everyone why Johnson's attempt at political rehabilitation was so offensive. The right honorable gentleman stands here today, trying to rebuild his reputation, trying to position himself as an elder statesman who can offer wisdom and leadership, she said, her voice filled with contempt. But the British people haven't forgotten. They haven't forgotten the lies, the scandals, the chaos, the complete breakdown of trust that marked his time in office. She gestured toward the Conservative benches. Even his own MPs couldn't defend him in the end. They forced him out because they knew he had become a liability to democracy itself. The reminder that Johnson's own party had rejected him was particularly damaging because it came from his political opponents, but echoed the judgment of his allies. And now he has the audacity to question my qualifications, Rayner said, her voice rising with indignation. A man who was forced from office in disgrace, whose dishonesty became so blatant that his own MPs couldn't defend it. The contrast was complete. Johnson, forced from office by his own party for dishonesty, was questioning the qualifications of someone who had earned her position through hard work and authentic representation of her constituents. I'll tell you about qualifications, Rayner said, looking directly at Johnson. Honesty is a qualification. Integrity is a qualification. Understanding the lives of the people you represent is a qualification. She paused, then delivered the final blow. And by those standards, the right honorable gentleman was never qualified for the offices he held, and he certainly isn't qualified to lecture anyone about housing policy or anything else. The silence that followed was deafening. Johnson sat, in his seat, visibly shaken, unable to respond to the systematic destruction of his credibility and record. Conservative MPs sat quietly, knowing that everything Rayner had said was true, and that Johnson's attempt to attack her had backfired spectacularly. But Rayner wasn't quite finished. She had one final point to make, not about Johnson, but about the politics he represented. "This debate today has shown exactly what's wrong with our political system," she said, her voice now calm but filled with conviction. "We have people who think their privilege qualifies them to speak for others, while dismissing those who have actually lived the experiences they're talking about." She looked around the chamber, speaking to MPs from both sides. "The housing crisis won't be solved by people who've never worried about paying rent. It won't be solved by people who inherited their wealth and think that makes them experts on poverty. It will be solved by listening to people who have lived these experiences, by implementing policies based on evidence rather than ideology, and by having leaders who tell the truth rather than whatever they think people want to hear." The final line was a perfect summary of everything that separated Rayner from Johnson: experience versus privilege, honesty versus dishonesty, authenticity versus performance. As Rayner sat down, the chamber erupted in applause from Labour MPs and stunned silence from Conservatives. Johnson remained in his seat, looking shell-shocked and defeated. The Speaker called for order, but everyone knew that something significant had just happened. Angela Rayner hadn't just won a political argument, she had delivered a masterclass in holding power accountable. The political earthquake that followed Angela Rayner's destruction of Boris Johnson was immediate and profound. Within minutes of a speech ending, the entire political landscape had shifted, and Johnson's attempted comeback was effectively over before it had really begun. The immediate reaction in the chamber was telling. Conservative MPs sat in stunned silence, many avoiding eye contact with Johnson entirely. Several were seen shaking their heads, clearly embarrassed by their former leader's performance and the devastating response it had provoked. Labour MPs, meanwhile, were barely containing their excitement. Rayner had articulated everything they had wanted to say about Johnson's record, but had never been able to express so powerfully. The systematic dismantling of his credibility was everything they had hoped for and more. But the most significant reaction came from Johnson himself. The man who had built his career on never being lost for words sat silently in his seat, visibly shaken by the precision and power of Rayner's attack. When he finally left the chamber, he looked like a man who knew his political rehabilitation was over. The media reaction was swift and unanimous. Even traditionally, conservative newspapers acknowledged that Rayner had delivered one of the most devastating parliamentary performances in recent memory. The Times headline read, "Rayner reminds Britain why Johnson was unfit for office." The Telegraph, usually supportive of conservative politicians, wrote, "Johnson's comeback attempt dies in Commons chamber." The Guardian's headline was more direct, "Rayner destroys Johnson's reputation with truth about his record." But it was the reaction on social media that showed the true impact of Rayner's speech. Video clips of her most devastating moments were shared millions of times across all platforms. The hashtag Rayner destroys Johnson trended for days, with even some conservative voters acknowledging that she had made powerful points. The most viral moment was when Rayner said, "His lies have cost lives, and everyone in this chamber knows it." That 15-second clip got over 5 million views in the first 24 hours and was shared by people across the political spectrum who felt it captured something important about accountability in politics. Another viral moment was her response to Johnson's attack on her background. "I understand housing policy in a way that someone who was born into privilege and has never worried about paying rent could never understand." The clip resonated particularly strongly with working-class voters who felt that Rayner was speaking for them. International media also picked up the story, with CNN, the BBC World Service, and major European newspapers covering what they described as a masterclass in political accountability. The New York Times wrote, "In an era when political lies often go unchallenged, British MP Angela Rayner showed how to hold power accountable with facts, passion, and moral clarity. But the most significant impact was on British politics itself. Rayner's speech had reminded everyone why Johnson had been forced from office and why his attempt at rehabilitation was inappropriate. Conservative MPs who had been quietly supporting Johnson's return to prominence quickly distanced themselves. Several told journalists that Johnson's attack on Rayner had been completely inappropriate and that his response to her speech had shown he hadn't learned from his mistakes. Sir Graham Brady, the influential chair of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers, made a rare public statement. The exchange in the Commons today reminded us why leadership requires not just ambition, but integrity, honesty, and respect for others. Even more damaging for Johnson was the reaction from conservative voters. Polling conducted in the days following the debate showed that Rayner's speech had been highly effective in reminding people of Johnson's failures. A YouGov poll found that 67% of voters agreed with Rayner's statement that Johnson's lies had cost lives. Even among conservative voters, 34% agreed with that assessment. Most damaging for Johnson's rehabilitation hopes was that 58% of all voters, including 31% of conservative voters, said the debate had made them less likely to support Johnson, playing a significant role in future conservative politics. The poll numbers were devastating because they showed that Johnson's attack on Rayner had backfired completely. Instead of damaging her credibility, it had reminded people of his own failures and dishonesty. The impact on Rayner's own political standing was the opposite. Her approval ratings soared following the debate, with voters praising her authenticity, preparation, and moral clarity. Labour strategists were delighted with the attention the speech had generated. Rayner had managed to remind the country of the Conservative Party's failures under Johnson, while also establishing herself as a powerful voice for working-class voters. Her personal story, growing up in social housing, becoming a teenage mother, working her way up through trade unions to become deputy leader of the Labour Party, became a powerful contrast to Johnson's privileged background. The speech also had significant implications for the Conservative Party's internal politics. Johnson's humiliation in the Commons effectively ended any prospect of him playing a significant role in the party's future. Conservative donors who had been considering supporting Johnson's political activities quickly backed away. Several major conservative figures publicly distanced themselves from Johnson's comeback attempt. Most significantly, Conservative Party leader Rishi Sunak was forced to address the controversy. While avoiding directly criticizing Johnson, Sunak made it clear that the party was focused on moving forward rather than relitigating the past. The subtle rebuke was widely interpreted as Sunak's way of saying that Johnson's time was over and that his comeback attempt was unwelcome. The debate also had broader implications for British political discourse. Rayner had shown how to challenge dishonest politicians effectively, not through personal insults or cheap shots, but through systematic presentation of facts and moral arguments. Political commentators noted that Rayner's approach could serve as a model for how opposition politicians should hold the government accountable. Instead of just criticizing policies, she had connected those policies to real human costs and had grounded her arguments in personal experience and documented facts. The speech also highlighted the importance of authentic representation in politics. Rayner's working-class background, rather than being a disadvantage as Johnson had suggested, had given her insights and credibility that no amount of elite education could provide. Within weeks of the debate, several political parties across Europe were pointing to Rayner's speech as an example of effective opposition politics. Her combination of personal authenticity, policy expertise, and moral clarity had created a template for holding powerful politicians accountable. For Johnson personally, the aftermath was devastating. His attempted return to frontline politics was effectively over. Media appearances that had been planned were quietly cancelled. Speaking engagements were withdrawn. Most humiliatingly, several Conservative MPs who had previously supported Johnson's rehabilitation publicly changed their positions. One former cabinet minister told the BBC, "Angela Rayner reminded us why Boris became impossible to defend. We can't make the same mistake twice." The debate had also reminded everyone of the specific policy failures that had marked Johnson's time in office. Housing charities and campaign groups seized on Rayner's statistics about housing failures, using them to renew pressure for policy changes. The speech gave new momentum to Labour's housing policies, with Rayner's personal story and policy expertise, combining to make a powerful case for change. 6 months after the debate, polling showed that it had been a significant turning point in British politics. Johnson's approval ratings had fallen to their lowest levels since his resignation as Prime Minister. Rayner's had increased dramatically, establishing her as one of the most popular politicians in the country. The title of this story was "Angela Rayner Destroys Boris Johnson During Fiery Debate." And that's exactly what happened. Rayner had used Johnson's own words, his own record, and his own failures to systematically destroy his credibility and end his comeback attempt. But more than just destroying Johnson personally, Rayner had provided a masterclass in how democracy should work, holding powerful people accountable, challenging dishonesty with facts, and representing the interests of ordinary people against the privileged elite. The debate became a defining moment for both politicians. For Johnson, it was the final confirmation that his time was over, and that his legacy would be one of dishonesty and failure. For Rayner, it was the moment she established herself as one of the most effective political voices of her generation. In the end, the confrontation proved that in democracy, truth and authenticity are more powerful than privilege and spin. Angela Rayner had reminded everyone that the best qualification for political office isn't where you went to school or who your parents were. It's whether you understand the lives of the people you represent and whether you're willing to tell them the truth. What did you think of Angela Rayner's takedown of Boris Johnson? Do you think more politicians should challenge dishonest leaders this directly? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing your thoughts on these powerful political moments. And if you enjoyed watching someone finally hold Boris Johnson accountable for his record of lies and failures, make sure to smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We've got more incredible stories coming about politicians getting the accountability they deserve. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Also, let me know in the comments. Do you think Angela Rayner should run for Labour Party leader? And which other politicians do you think need to be held accountable like this? The political drama never stops, and neither do we.